Marcus Chen never expected his YouTube channel to change everything. The 34-year-old software engineer from Phoenix had been making exploration videos for 3 years, documenting abandoned places across the Southwest for his modest following of 12,000 subscribers. His channel, Desert Discoveries, featured forgotten ghost towns, abandoned mines, and the occasional UFO hotspot that drew curious viewers. On that October morning in 2023, Marcus was filming what he hoped would be his breakthrough video, testing a brand-new $3,000 drone in one of Arizona's most remote locations. He'd driven 3 hours to reach this desolate stretch of the Mojave Desert, drawn by online forums claiming the area was perfect for aerial cinematography. The plan was simple: capture stunning 4K footage of the untouched wilderness, maybe find some interesting rock formations or wildlife, and hopefully hit that elusive 100,000 view milestone that had been dodging him for months. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and creosote, as Marcus set up his equipment near the remnants of what locals called Dead Man's Road, an abandoned route that once connected small mining towns before being bypassed by Interstate 40 in the 1960s. The asphalt had long since cracked and surrendered to desert reclamation, leaving only scattered chunks of pavement and rusted guardrails as evidence of human passage. Marcus launched the drone at 7:43 a.m., according to his phone's timestamp. The device climbed steadily, its camera capturing sweeping views of the endless expanse of sand, rock, and scattered Joshua trees. He was looking for interesting geological formations, maybe some wildlife, perhaps the remains of old mining equipment that would make for compelling social media content. At first, the object wedged between 2 massive boulders looked like debris, the kind of industrial waste that occasionally found its way into even the most remote corners of the desert. But as Marcus adjusted the camera's zoom and angle, something made him pause. The metallic glint caught the morning sun in a way that seemed deliberate, purposeful. He brought the drone lower, its rotors whining against the desert wind. The image on his controller's screen sharpened, revealing what appeared to be a piece of metal, roughly rectangular, with faded letters and numbers barely visible beneath decades of sand and weather damage. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. It was part of a license plate, and there was something else. A larger piece of metal, curved and white, partially buried in the sand nearby. But what made his blood run cold was what he saw next: a small, weathered photograph, half buried in the sand, showing 4 smiling faces. The photo was sun-bleached and torn, but unmistakably a family portrait: 2 parents and 2 children, posed in front of what looked like an RV. One corner of the photograph had been weighted down by a small rock, as if someone had deliberately placed it there to be found. "Holy shit," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the drone's motors. This wasn't just abandoned debris. This was evidence of something much darker. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the drone's motors. He maneuvered the aircraft for a better angle, the camera now focused on what looked like part of a vehicle's exterior paneling. The white paint was faded and scarred, but unmistakable. Marcus captured nearly 20 minutes of footage before the drone's battery forced him to land. His hands shook slightly as he reviewed the images on his laptop in the back of his SUV. The license plate fragment was clear enough to make out partial letters, AZ, and what looked like 499 or 999. The accompanying debris suggested something much larger. A truck, maybe even an RV, had met its end in this desolate place. The responsible thing to do was obvious, but Marcus hesitated. He'd heard stories about people who'd stumbled upon crime scenes in the desert, how they'd become entangled in investigations that consumed months or years of their lives. But as he stared at the footage, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, might still be wondering what had happened to whoever owned that vehicle. At 2:17 p.m. that same day, Marcus dialed the Coconino County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher who answered sounded skeptical at first. Desert discoveries were common enough. usually amounting to nothing more than abandoned vehicles or old mining equipment. But something in Marcus's voice, or perhaps the specific details he provided, prompted her to patch him through to Detective Sarah Kozlowski, a 15-year veteran of the department who specialized in cold cases. "You said you found what looked like a license plate?" Detective Kozlowski asked, her tone professional but engaged. "Can you describe the numbers and letters you could make out?" Marcus read from his notes, describing the AZ designation and the partial numbers. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Can you send me that footage?" she asked. "I'm going to need GPS coordinates, too." What Marcus didn't know was that Detective Kozlowski had been with the sheriff's office in 1999, when she was still a rookie deputy. She remembered the case that had consumed the department for months that summer, the disappearance of the Hartwell family, whose Arizona license plate had ended with the numbers 2499. The Hartwells had been living their dream. David Hartwell, 42, had spent 15 years as a mechanical engineer for an aerospace company in Phoenix before early retirement packages and a substantial inheritance from his late father allowed him to pursue what he'd always called the real American adventure. His wife, Linda, 39, had been a high school art teacher who'd grown increasingly disillusioned with budget cuts and administrative demands that seemed to squeeze the creativity out of education. Their children, 16-year-old Sarah and 12-year-old Michael, had initially protested the radical change in lifestyle. Sarah was entering her junior year of high school, worried about leaving her friends and boyfriend behind. Michael had been less vocal but equally reluctant, concerned about missing baseball season and the video games he'd worked all summer to afford. But David's enthusiasm was infectious. Throughout the spring of 1999, he'd spent weekends transforming a used 1995 Winnebago Adventurer into what he called the perfect mobile home. The 35-foot motorhome featured a full kitchen, bathroom, and sleeping quarters for 4. David had installed solar panels, upgraded the electrical system, and even added a satellite dish for television reception in remote areas. Linda documented their preparations in a journal she'd started that March, writing in her careful teacher's handwriting about the family's evolving excitement. Sarah found a book about homeschooling on the road, she wrote on April 15th. She's actually starting to warm up to the idea of seeing the country instead of sitting in classrooms all day. Michael asked if we could visit every Major League Baseball stadium. David says, why not? The plan was ambitious but carefully structured. They would spend the summer of 1999 traveling a meandering route from Phoenix to Maine, visiting national parks, historical sites, and relatives scattered across the country. David had mapped out their journey with military precision, marking campsites, fuel stops, and points of interest on a collection of 8AA travel guides that filled a plastic storage bin. Linda's journal entries from those early months reveal a family in transition, gradually embracing the adventure despite initial reservations. "Today we practiced setting up camp in the backyard," she wrote on May 3rd. "Michael timed us, 7 minutes to get everything connected and leveled. David says we'll get it down to 5 minutes by the end of the trip." The photographs they left behind tell the story of that preparation period. David, stocky and bearded, wearing his favorite Phoenix Suns cap as he worked on the RV's engine. Linda, petite with shoulder-length brown hair, laughing as she attempted to back the massive vehicle out of their driveway. Sarah, tall for her age with her mother's features and her father's determined expression, reading travel brochures with skeptical interest. Michael, small for 12, but with an energy that seemed to vibrate through even still photographs, standing proudly beside the RV with a baseball glove tucked under his arm. They departed Phoenix on July 12, 1999, a Monday morning that dawned clear and promising. David had loaded the RV the night before, checking and rechecking his meticulously organized supplies. The vehicle carried enough food for 2 weeks, water for a month, and camping equipment for every conceivable scenario. Linda had packed a library of books, art supplies, and educational materials for the children. Sarah had been allowed to bring her CD player and a collection of music that represented her teenage musical tastes. Michael had packed 3 baseball gloves, convinced he'd find pickup games in every town they visited. Their first stop was Flagstaff, where they planned to visit the Lowell Observatory before continuing east toward the Grand Canyon. The drive should have taken less than 3 hours, but David had deliberately chosen a leisurely pace, wanting the family to savor the journey rather than rush toward destinations. Linda's last journal entry was written that first night, from a campground outside Flagstaff. Day 1 of the great adventure. The kids are asleep, and David is studying tomorrow's route by lamplight. The RV feels so different from our house. Smaller, obviously, but somehow more intimate. We're all within 10 feet of each other, but it doesn't feel cramped. It feels cozy, safe. I keep thinking about how many families never get to do something like this. We're lucky. She had no way of knowing that within 72 hours, their luck would run out in the most complete and inexplicable way possible. The last confirmed sighting of the Hartwell family occurred on July 15, 1999, at a Chevron station in Winslow, Arizona. Security footage from that day shows the family's RV pulling up to the fuel pumps at 3:42 p.m. The video, though grainy by modern standards, clearly shows David stepping out of the driver's seat, his movements casual and unhurried. He's wearing khaki shorts and a blue polo shirt, his baseball cap tilted against the afternoon sun. The footage shows Linda emerging from the passenger side, stretching her arms above her head in the universal gesture of someone who's been sitting too long. She walks toward the station's convenience store, disappearing from the camera's view. Meanwhile, David begins fueling the RV, occasionally wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Sarah and Michael remain inside the vehicle throughout the stop, though Michael can be seen briefly in one of the windows, his face pressed against the glass as he watches something outside the camera's range. The total stop lasts 18 minutes, ending when the family climbs back into the RV and drives away, heading east on Interstate 40. That security footage became one of the most watched pieces of evidence in the case, analyzed frame by investigators, and later by amateur sleuths who discovered it online. Every gesture, every expression, every detail was scrutinized for signs of distress or unusual behavior. But the family appeared relaxed, even happy. Linda was smiling when she returned from the store, carrying what appeared to be snacks and beverages. David's interaction with the RV's fuel system was practiced and efficient. The children seemed content, perhaps even excited about whatever they'd been observing outside. What made the footage particularly haunting was its absolute ordinariness. This was a family on vacation, performing the mundane tasks that mark any long journey. There was no indication that anything was wrong, no suggestion that they were about to vanish from the world as completely as if they'd never existed at all. The clerk who worked that shift, a 19-year-old named Tommy Reeves, remembered the family clearly when investigators interviewed him 3 days later. "They seemed really nice," he told Detective Kozlowski. "The mom bought some postcards and asked about scenic routes to the Grand Canyon. The dad asked about road conditions, whether there were any construction delays. Normal vacation stuff." Tommy recalled that Linda had mentioned they were planning to see the sunset at Desert View, a popular overlook on the Grand Canyon's south rim. She said they'd been planning this trip for months, that it was their dream vacation. The kids seemed excited, too. The boy was asking about Native American ruins, whether we had any maps of archaeological sites. Based on that conversation, the family should have taken Interstate 40 east to Highway 64, then north to the Grand Canyon. It was a well-traveled route, popular with tourists and clearly marked. But somewhere between Winslow and their intended destination, the Hartwells made a decision that would lead them into the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Arizona desert. The first indication that something was wrong came on July 17th, when David failed to call his brother in Colorado as planned. Tom Hartwell, a Denver police officer, had been expecting the call around 6 p.m. Mountain Time. When his phone remained silent, he initially assumed the family had simply lost track of time or encountered cell phone coverage issues, both common problems for travelers in remote areas. But when July 18th passed without contact, Tom's concern deepened. David was methodical about maintaining communication, particularly since the family was traveling with children. Tom called the Grand Canyon National Park Service, hoping the family had simply extended their stay without thinking to call home. The Park Service had no record of the Hartwells' arrival. Their reservations for the Mather campground had gone unused, and no one matching their description had been seen at any of the park's visitor centers or overlooks. Tom then called the Coconino County Sheriff's Office, officially reporting his brother's family as missing. Detective Kozlowski caught the case on July 19th, beginning what would become the most extensive missing persons investigation in the county's history. Her first step was to trace the family's route from Phoenix to Winslow, confirming their last known location and establishing a timeline for their disappearance. The trail appeared to end at the Chevron station, but Kozlowski suspected the family had continued traveling after their fuel stop. She began the painstaking process of checking every business, campground, and tourist attraction along the routes the Hartwells might have taken from Winslow to the Grand Canyon. The breakthrough came on July 21st, when a maintenance worker at a remote highway rest stop called the sheriff's office. Jim Valdez had been cleaning restrooms along a section of Old Highway 99, a largely abandoned route that had once connected Winslow to Flagstaff before being superseded by the interstate. While emptying trash receptacles, he'd found something unusual: a child's baseball glove, still relatively clean despite being discarded. It looked new, Valdez told Detective Kozlowski. Like somebody had just dropped it, maybe that morning. I thought it was weird because hardly anybody uses this road anymore. Just truckers taking shortcuts, mostly. The glove was a Wilson A2000, a high-quality model that retailed for more than $200. Detective Kozlowski remembered Tommy Reeves mentioning that the Hartwell boy had been asking about archaeological sites, and she wondered if the family might have decided to explore some of the area's less traveled routes in search of Native American ruins. Highway 99 had been built in the 1940s to serve the region's mining industry, but it had fallen into disrepair after Interstate 40's completion. By 1999, most of the asphalt had deteriorated into gravel and dirt, passable by four-wheel drive vehicles but challenging for larger RVs. The route wound through some of the most isolated terrain in Arizona, past abandoned mines and ghost towns that had been reclaimed by the desert. Detective Kozlowski organized the first search operation on July 22nd, deploying teams along Highway 99 and its various offshoots. The search included ground teams, helicopter overflights, and tracking dogs trained to detect human scent. The operation covered nearly 500 square miles of desert terrain, focusing on areas where an RV might have become stuck or disabled. The search yielded frustrating results. Teams found tire tracks that might have belonged to the Hartwells' RV, but the desert's shifting sands and frequent winds made it impossible to determine when the tracks had been made. They discovered several abandoned vehicles, including 2 RVs, but none belonged to the missing family. On July 24th, searchers found what appeared to be their first significant clue. A piece of fabric, caught on a Joshua tree about 2 miles from Highway 99, matched the description of a shirt Michael Hartwell had been wearing in the Chevron station security footage. The fabric was sun-bleached and weathered, suggesting it had been exposed to the elements for several days. The discovery prompted an intensive search of the surrounding area. Teams combed through arroyos, examined every cave and rock formation, and used metal detectors to search for buried objects. But the fabric remained an isolated clue, leading nowhere. As the days passed, the search operation expanded to include volunteers from Phoenix and surrounding communities. The case had attracted local media attention, and the story of the missing family resonated with people who had taken similar road trips with their own children. Search teams swelled to include hundreds of volunteers, many of whom had no experience in desert rescue operations, but were motivated by a desire to help find the Hartwells. The volunteer searchers were organized into grid patterns, systematically covering areas that professional teams had already examined. The hope was that additional eyes might spot something that had been missed, or that the family might have moved since the initial search. Dr. Jennifer Morrison, a forensic anthropologist from Arizona State University, joined the investigation on July 28. Her expertise in desert preservation and human remains made her uniquely qualified to assess the challenges facing the missing family. Her analysis was sobering. "The desert is unforgiving," she told Detective Kozlowski during a briefing that week. "Daytime temperatures in July can exceed 120 degrees, and nighttime temperatures can drop to 60 degrees or lower. Without adequate water and shelter, survival becomes increasingly unlikely after 72 hours. We're now approaching 2 weeks." Dr. Morrison explained that the desert's extreme conditions could preserve human remains for decades, but also made them difficult to locate. Bodies could be buried by shifting sands, hidden in caves, or scattered by wildlife. The vastness of the search area meant that even a systematic grid search might miss remains by mere feet. The psychological toll of the extended search was evident in Detective Kozlowski's notes from that period. "Volunteers are getting discouraged," she wrote on July 30th. "We've covered thousands of acres and found virtually nothing. The family seems to have vanished completely. I'm starting to wonder if we're searching in the wrong area entirely." That same day, the investigation took an unexpected turn when a gas station attendant in Gallup, New Mexico, called the sheriff's office. Maria Santos claimed she'd seen an RV matching the Hartwells' description at her station on July 16th, the day after their last confirmed sighting in Winslow. "I remember them because the kids looked upset," Santos told Detective Kozlowski over the phone. "The boy was crying, and the girl looked scared. I asked if everything was okay, but the man said they were just tired from traveling." Santos's account was troubling because it suggested the family had traveled much farther than previously thought, potentially crossing into New Mexico before something went wrong. But when Detective Kozlowski drove to Gallup to interview Santos in person, inconsistencies in her story became apparent. The woman couldn't remember specific details about the RV or its occupants, and security footage from her station showed no record of the Hartwells' visit. Santos eventually admitted that she'd been mistaken, possibly confusing the Hartwell family with another group of travelers. The false lead had cost precious time and resources, but it also highlighted the intense public interest in the case. By August 1st, the official search operation was scaled back to a core team of professional investigators. The massive volunteer effort had been suspended, though many individuals continued searching on their own time. The case had generated thousands of tips, ranging from credible sightings to elaborate conspiracy theories, but none had led to the family's discovery. Detective Kozlowski found herself grappling with theories that seemed to belong in thriller novels rather than police reports. Some callers suggested the family had been kidnapped by human traffickers operating along the Mexican border. Others theorized that the Hartwells had witnessed a crime and been eliminated by criminals. A few proposed that the family had deliberately disappeared, perhaps to escape financial problems or legal troubles. But investigation into the family's background revealed no evidence of financial stress, legal issues, or personal problems that might motivate a planned disappearance. David's aerospace company confirmed he'd received a substantial severance package and had no outstanding debts. Linda's former school district described her as a dedicated teacher with no disciplinary issues. The children's school records showed no behavioral problems or academic struggles. The family's bank records, examined with a court order, showed no unusual transactions or large cash withdrawals that might indicate preparation for a disappearance. Their credit cards hadn't been used since the fuel purchase in Winslow. Phone records confirmed that David had made the planned call to his brother on July 14th, expressing enthusiasm about the trip and providing no indication of distress. As summer turned to fall, the investigation entered a new phase. Detective Kozlowski began exploring the possibility that the family had encountered some form of accident or mechanical failure that had left them stranded in the desert. The 1995 Winnebago, while well-maintained, was still a complex vehicle operating under challenging conditions. She consulted with RV mechanics and desert survival experts, trying to understand what might have gone wrong. The consensus was that mechanical failure was possible but unlikely to have been catastrophic enough to prevent the family from calling for help. The RV was equipped with a CB radio, and David had been carrying a cell phone, though coverage in remote areas was spotty. The investigation also considered the possibility of medical emergency. If David had suffered a heart attack or stroke while driving, he might have lost control of the vehicle in a remote area. But medical records showed no history of serious health problems for any family member, and Linda was capable of driving the RV if necessary. As 1999 drew to a close, the Hartwell case had consumed thousands of hours of investigation and generated a case file that filled several boxes. Detective Kozlowski had interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on more than 1,000 tips, and coordinated search operations across 3 states. But the family remained as mysteriously absent as they had been on the day they vanished. The case received renewed attention in early 2000, when it was featured on the television show America's Most Wanted. The episode generated hundreds of new tips, but none led to significant breakthroughs. A few viewers claimed to have seen the family in various locations across the Southwest, but none of these sightings could be verified. The most promising lead came from a retired park ranger who claimed to have seen an RV matching the Hartwell's description stuck in sand near a remote canyon in Utah. But when investigators reached the location, they found only the rusted remains of a vehicle that had been abandoned for decades. By 2001, the case had been officially classified as a cold case, though it remained open. Detective Kozlowski continued to follow up on occasional tips, but the active investigation had effectively ended. The family's disappearance had become part of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of desert travel that parents shared with their children. Tom Hartwell, David's brother, refused to give up hope. He organized annual search expeditions, recruiting volunteers to examine areas that official searches might have missed. These efforts continued for several years, gradually diminishing as hope faded, and volunteers moved on to other causes. The Hartwell case joined the ranks of America's most perplexing missing persons cases, discussed in true crime forums, and featured in documentaries about unsolved mysteries. Various theories proliferated online, ranging from plausible to preposterous. Some amateur investigators became convinced that the family had been murdered by a serial killer operating in the Southwest. Others maintained that the Hartwells had successfully disappeared and were living under assumed identities. Detective Kozlowski retired from the sheriff's office in 2015, but she never stopped thinking about the case that had defined her career. She'd kept copies of the case files, occasionally reviewing them in hopes of spotting some detail that had been overlooked. The passage of time had given her perspective on the investigation, but it had also made her more convinced that the family's fate would remain forever unknown. The years passed quietly. The Hartwell case was mentioned occasionally in articles about cold cases, but public interest gradually waned. The family's Phoenix house was sold, their possessions distributed among relatives. Sarah would have turned 40 in 2023, Michael would have been 36. Their parents, if alive, would have been in their 60s. Detective Kozlowski, now retired and living in Sedona, had settled into a routine that included morning hikes and afternoon reading. She'd written a book about her police career, devoting an entire chapter to the Hartwell case. The book had sold modestly, attracting readers interested in true crime stories, but it had brought no new information about the missing family. On October 15, 2023, Detective Kozlowski was tending to her garden when her phone rang. The caller ID showed the Coconino County Sheriff's Office, and for a moment she wondered if one of her former colleagues needed advice on an old case. But the voice on the other end belonged to Detective Mike Rodriguez, who had joined the department years after her retirement. "Sarah, I think we found them," he said without preamble. The Hartwells. A drone pilot discovered some wreckage in the desert, and the license plate matches their RV. Detective Kozlowski felt her heart rate increase. After more than 2 decades, the case that had consumed so much of her career was about to be reopened. She grabbed her keys and headed for her car, knowing that the next few days would provide answers to questions that had haunted her for nearly a quarter-century. The scene that greeted the search team on October 16th was both anticlimactic and deeply unsettling. The wreckage was located in a narrow canyon about 15 miles from the old Highway 99, accessible only by hiking through rough terrain that would have been impassable to most vehicles. The RV had somehow traveled far from any established road, coming to rest in a position that seemed to defy logical explanation. The vehicle was partially buried by decades of sand and debris, but enough remained visible to confirm its identity. The license plate, though damaged and faded, clearly read Arizona 2499. The RV's distinctive blue and white paint scheme was still visible beneath the weathering, and the solar panels David had installed were recognizable despite being cracked and sand-blasted. Crime scene investigators worked carefully to excavate the site, using brushes and small tools to preserve any evidence that might have survived the desert's harsh conditions. The process was slow and meticulous, complicated by the need to document everything before it was disturbed. The RV's interior had been remarkably preserved by the dry desert air. Sand had infiltrated through broken windows and deteriorated seals, but many of the family's possessions remained identifiable. Linda's journal was found in a kitchen drawer, its pages brittle but readable. David's maps and travel guides were scattered throughout the cabin, some still folded to show their planned route. The children's belongings were heartbreaking in their normalcy. Sarah's CD collection was found in a storage compartment, the plastic cases cracked, but the discs still playable. Michael's baseball gloves were discovered in a bedroom closet, along with a collection of baseball cards that had somehow survived the intervening decades. But it was what wasn't found that made the discovery truly disturbing. The RV contained the remains of 3 people, positively identified through dental records as David, Linda, and Sarah Hartwell. Michael's body was nowhere to be found. The positioning of the remains suggested that the family had died inside the RV, possibly from dehydration or heat exhaustion. There were no signs of violence, no indication of struggle or foul play. David was found in the driver's seat, Linda in the passenger seat, and Sarah on one of the beds in the rear of the vehicle. All appeared to have died peacefully, perhaps in their sleep. The mystery of Michael's absence dominated the investigation. Had he left the RV before the others died? Had his body been removed by animals or natural forces? Or had he somehow survived the ordeal that claimed his family? A thorough search of the area surrounding the RV was conducted, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains. The search expanded to cover several square miles, focusing on areas where a 12-year-old boy might have sought shelter or water. On October 20th, the search team made a discovery that added another layer to the mystery. About a quarter-mile from the RV, partially buried beneath a pile of rocks, they found a digital camera that had belonged to the family. The camera was a relatively advanced model for 1999, and its internal memory had been protected by a waterproof case. The camera contained 47 photographs, taken during the family's final days. The images told a story of increasing desperation and growing awareness that they were in serious trouble. The first photographs showed the family posing happily beside their RV, with the desert landscape stretching endlessly in all directions. David and Linda were smiling, their arms around each other, while Sarah and Michael stood nearby, looking less enthusiastic but not obviously distressed. But as the sequence progressed, the tone of the photographs changed dramatically. Later images showed the family's growing concern as they realized they were lost. David was photographed examining maps, his expression increasingly worried. Linda was shown rationing water, carefully measuring amounts into small cups. The children appeared frightened and confused, clinging to their parents as the situation deteriorated. The final photographs were the most disturbing. They showed the family's increasingly desperate attempts to signal for help. David had arranged rocks to spell out "help" in large letters, visible from the air. Linda had hung bright clothing from the RV's windows and awning, creating makeshift signals. The children were shown waving at aircraft that were too distant to see their distress. The last photograph on the camera showed Michael standing alone beside the RV, his face streaked with tears and dust. The image was taken at a downward angle, as if by someone taller, possibly one of his parents. The timestamp indicated it was taken on July 18, 1999, 3 days after the family's last confirmed sighting in Winslow. The photograph raised more questions than it answered. Why was Michael alone in the image? Where were his parents and sister? Had they already died by the time this final picture was taken? And if Michael had survived longer than the others, what had happened to him? Dr. Morrison, the forensic anthropologist who had worked on the original case, was called in to examine the remains and provide insights into the family's final days. Her analysis confirmed that David, Linda, and Sarah had died from dehydration and heat exhaustion, their bodies showing the classic signs of desert exposure. They probably survived for 5 or 6 days after becoming stranded, she told the investigation team. The RV would have provided some shelter from the sun, and they had water supplies, but not enough for an extended period in extreme heat. Their deaths would have been peaceful, essentially falling asleep as their bodies shut down. But Michael's absence remained inexplicable. Dr. Morrison examined the area around the RV for any signs of a fourth body, but found nothing. The boy had simply vanished, leaving no trace of his final fate. The investigation team considered various theories. Perhaps Michael had wandered away from the RV, possibly in search of help or water, and had died somewhere beyond the search area. The desert was vast, and a child's remains could easily be overlooked even in a systematic search. Another possibility was that Michael had survived longer than his family, perhaps sustained by a larger share of the remaining water. But if that were the case, why hadn't he been found? The boy was only 12 years old with no survival training or desert experience. It seemed unlikely that he could have survived alone for any extended period. The most unsettling theory was that Michael had never reached the RV's final location. Perhaps he had become separated from his family earlier in their ordeal, lost in the desert while they were still mobile. This would explain his absence from the scene, but it would also mean that his remains were scattered somewhere across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. Detective Rodriguez, who had inherited the case from Detective Kozlowski, found himself grappling with the same questions that had haunted his predecessor. The discovery of the RV had answered some questions about the family's fate, but it had raised new mysteries that seemed equally impossible to solve. The media attention surrounding the discovery was intense. The case had captured public imagination 24 years earlier, and its resolution generated headlines across the country. Television crews descended on the desert site, though access was restricted to preserve the integrity of the ongoing investigation. Tom Hartwell, now in his 70s and living in retirement in Colorado, traveled to Arizona to see the site where his brother's family had died. The visit was emotionally devastating, but it also provided a form of closure that had been denied to him for more than 2 decades. "I always hoped they were alive somewhere," he told reporters after visiting the site. "Maybe living under different names, maybe suffering from amnesia or something. I know it sounds crazy, but hope is all we had for 24 years. Now I know they're at peace, even if we still don't know exactly what happened." The question of Michael's fate continued to dominate the investigation. Searches were expanded to cover areas where the family might have traveled before reaching their final location. Teams examined every canyon, cave, and rock formation within a 20-mile radius of the RV, looking for any sign of the missing boy. The search efforts were hampered by the passage of time and the harsh desert environment. Any remains that might have survived would be scattered and difficult to identify. The desert's wildlife, including coyotes, ravens, and insects, would have quickly dispersed organic material. Even bones might have been carried far from their original location. Dr. Morrison supervised the searches, applying her expertise in desert preservation to guide the investigation. She explained to the team that child remains were particularly difficult to locate because they were smaller and more easily scattered by natural forces. "We're looking for fragments," she told the search teams. "Pieces of bone, bits of clothing, anything that might have belonged to Michael. The desert preserves some things remarkably well, but it also hides them effectively." The searches continued for weeks, involving dozens of volunteers and several professional search teams. Ground-penetrating radar was used to examine areas where remains might be buried. Metal detectors searched for any objects that might have belonged to the boy. Every discovery was carefully documented and analyzed, but none provided evidence of Michael's fate. As November turned to December, the intensive search operations were gradually scaled back. The investigation remained open, but the focus shifted from active searching to analyzing the evidence that had been gathered. The hope was that laboratory analysis might provide insights that had been missed in the field. The digital camera found near the RV became a crucial piece of evidence. Computer specialists were able to enhance the images, looking for details that might have been missed in the original examination. The photographs were analyzed for background information, environmental clues, and any evidence of what had happened to Michael. The analysis revealed disturbing details about the family's final days. The progression of photographs showed their increasing desperation as they realized the severity of their situation. David's careful documentation of their attempts to signal for help suggested he maintained hope until the very end. Linda's rationing of water supplies indicated she understood the gravity of their predicament. But it was the children's presence in the photographs that was most heartbreaking. Sarah appeared increasingly withdrawn as the situation deteriorated, clinging to her parents and rarely smiling. Michael seemed to fluctuate between fear and curiosity, sometimes appearing engaged with their survival efforts, and sometimes seeming to retreat into himself. The final photograph of Michael remained the most significant clue to his fate. The image showed him standing alone, but the angle suggested it was taken by someone else, probably one of his parents. The timestamp indicated it was taken on July 18th, the same day the family was supposed to have called Tom Hartwell in Colorado. Computer analysis of the photograph revealed additional details. Michael was wearing different clothes than in earlier images, suggesting he had changed outfits at some point. His expression was difficult to read, but he appeared to be looking at something outside the camera's frame. The background showed the RV and surrounding landscape, but no other people were visible. The investigation team consulted with child psychologists to understand how a 12-year-old might react to the extreme stress of being lost in the desert. The experts suggested that Michael might have engaged in denial or wishful thinking, possibly wandering away from the RV in search of help or rescue. Children often maintain optimism longer than adults in crisis situations, explained Dr. Rebecca Chen, a child psychologist who consulted on the case. They may not fully grasp the severity of their situation, or they may believe that rescue is imminent. This could lead to impulsive decisions, like wandering away from safety in search of help. Dr. Chen's assessment provided a possible explanation for Michael's disappearance, but it also made his fate seem more tragic. If the boy had left the RV voluntarily, believing he could find help, he would have been even more vulnerable to the desert's dangers. The investigation team examined the area around the RV for any evidence of Michael's departure. They found what appeared to be small footprints in a wash about 200 yards from the vehicle, but the prints were too weathered to confirm they belonged to the missing boy. The direction of the prints suggested movement toward higher ground, possibly in search of a vantage point or cell phone signal. Following the potential trail, searchers discovered a small pile of rocks that had been arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. The arrangement was crude but unmistakably human in origin, suggesting someone had tried to create a marker or signal. The rocks were located on a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding desert, exactly where a lost person might go to look for signs of civilization. The discovery of the rock pile generated new hope that Michael's fate might be determined. The area was searched intensively, using every available technique to locate any additional evidence. But the ridge yielded no further clues, and the rock pile remained an isolated mystery. As 2023 drew to a close, the investigation entered a new phase. The physical searches had been largely completed, and the focus shifted to analyzing the evidence that had been gathered. The hope was that laboratory analysis and computer modeling might provide insights that had been missed in the field. The RV itself was transported to a secure facility where it could be examined in detail. Every inch of the vehicle was photographed and documented, and forensic specialists searched for any evidence that might explain what had happened to Michael. The process was painstaking, requiring weeks of careful work. The examination revealed additional details about the family's final days. Food supplies had been carefully rationed, with meals becoming increasingly sparse as the situation deteriorated. Water consumption had been strictly controlled, with every drop accounted for in a notebook that Linda had kept. The notebook's final entry, dated July 19th, simply read, "Water almost gone. God help us." Personal items found in the RV painted a picture of a family trying to maintain hope despite their desperate circumstances. Sarah's diary, found in her bedroom, contained entries describing her fear and confusion, but also her determination to stay strong for her younger brother. "Michael keeps asking when we're going home," she wrote on July 17th. "I told him soon, but I don't think Mom and Dad believe it anymore." Michael's belongings were scattered throughout the RV, suggesting he had been moving around freely until the very end. His baseball cards were found in various locations, as if he had been playing with them to pass time. A small notebook contained his attempts to document their situation, written in the careful handwriting of a 12-year-old. Day 4. Still lost. Dad says not to worry, but I think we are in trouble. The notebook's final entry, dated July 18th, was barely legible. "Going to look for help. Don't worry about me." The discovery of Michael's note provided the clearest evidence yet of what had happened to him. The boy had apparently left the RV voluntarily, believing he could find assistance for his family. The note's date corresponded with the final photograph on the camera, suggesting that Michael had left shortly after the picture was taken. Detective Rodriguez shared the discovery with Tom Hartwell, who was devastated by the implications. "He was just a kid," the elderly man said, his voice breaking. "He thought he could save his family. That's exactly the kind of thing Michael would do. He always wanted to be the hero." The investigation team used the information from Michael's note to refine their search efforts. They focused on areas where a 12-year-old boy might have traveled from the RV, looking for any signs of his passage. The search was complicated by the fact that 24 years had passed, erasing most traces of human activity. But the team persisted, using advanced techniques to search for evidence that might have survived the intervening decades. Ground-penetrating radar was used to examine areas where remains might be buried. Metal detectors searched for any objects that might have belonged to Michael. Forensic anthropologists examined every bone fragment discovered in the search area. The breakthrough came on December 15th, when a search team discovered a small cave about 3 miles from the RV. The cave was located in a rocky outcropping that would have been visible from the ridge where the rock pile had been found. Inside the cave, searchers found evidence of recent human habitation, or at least recent by desert standards. The cave contained the remains of a small campfire, though the ashes had long since been scattered by wind and weather. More significantly, searchers found fragments of clothing that appeared to match the description of what Michael had been wearing. The fabric was badly deteriorated, but enough remained to suggest it had once been a child's t-shirt. Near the back of the cave, searchers made their most significant discovery yet. Carefully arranged beneath a pile of rocks, they found a small skeleton that appeared to belong to a child. The remains were remarkably well preserved, protected by the cave's dry environment and the careful burial that someone had provided. Dr. Morrison was called to examine the remains, and her initial assessment confirmed what everyone had hoped and feared. The skeleton was that of a child, approximately 12 years old, and the dental remains matched Michael Hartwell's records. The boy had been found at last, 24 years after his disappearance. The discovery of Michael's remains provided closure to one of the most enduring mysteries in Arizona's history, but it also raised new questions about his final days. The careful arrangement of his body suggested that someone had buried him. But who? Had Michael encountered another person in the desert, someone who had tried to help him? Or had he somehow managed to prepare his own final resting place? Dr. Morrison's examination of the remains provided some answers. Michael had died from dehydration and exposure, the same causes that had claimed his family. But the condition of his bones suggested he had survived for several days after leaving the RV, possibly as long as a week. He made it farther than anyone expected, Dr. Morrison told the investigation team. The cave provided shelter from the sun, and there might have been some water nearby. He survived alone in the desert for days, which is remarkable for a 12-year-old. The evidence suggested that Michael had indeed left the RV in search of help, following the ridgeline toward higher ground. He had created the rock pile as a signal, then continued traveling until he reached the cave. The cave had provided temporary shelter, but without water or food, the boy had eventually succumbed to the desert's harsh conditions. The careful burial of Michael's remains remained unexplained. Dr. Morrison found no evidence of another person at the site, no additional belongings or signs of companionship. The most likely explanation was that Michael had somehow managed to arrange his own burial, perhaps using his remaining strength to cover himself with rocks in a final act of dignity. The investigation team examined the cave thoroughly, looking for any additional evidence that might explain Michael's final days. They found the remains of his attempt to create tools from rocks and sticks, suggesting he had tried to dig for water or signal for help. A small collection of desert plants near his remains indicated he had attempted to survive by eating vegetation, though most desert plants provide little nutrition. The discovery of Michael's remains brought the Hartwell case to a close after 24 years. The family had been found, their fate determined, and their final resting place identified. But the case had revealed as much about human resilience as it had about tragedy. But there was one final chilling detail that would haunt everyone involved in the investigation. When Dr. Morrison examined the digital camera more closely, she discovered something that had been missed in the initial analysis. The camera's memory contained one additional file, not a photograph, but a brief audio recording, accidentally captured when someone had pressed the wrong button in the darkness. The recording was only 17 seconds long, but it was unmistakably Michael's voice, weak and scared, speaking into the night. "Mom? Dad? I found some water. I think I found water. I'm gonna bring it back. Don't worry about me, I'm gonna save us all." The recording ended with the sound of footsteps in sand, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. It was the last time Michael Hartwell's voice would ever be heard. Tom Hartwell was present when Michael's remains were recovered from the cave. The elderly man stood silently as the small skeleton was carefully excavated, his tears mixing with the desert dust. "He tried so hard to save them," he whispered. "He was just a little boy, but he tried to be their hero." The Hartwell family was finally laid to rest together in a Phoenix cemetery on January 15, 2024. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including many who had participated in the original search efforts 24 years earlier. Detective Kozlowski, now in her 70s, delivered a eulogy that captured the case's impact on everyone who had been involved. "The Hartwells taught us about the power of family, about courage in the face of impossible odds, and about the importance of never giving up hope," she said. "They also taught us about the dangers of the desert and the need to respect the wilderness that surrounds us." The case had consumed thousands of hours of investigation, involved hundreds of searchers, and generated national media attention. But in the end, it was a story about a family's love for each other and their determination to stay together even in the face of death. Marcus Chen, The drone pilot whose discovery had reopened the case attended the funeral as well. He had never expected his weekend hobby to lead to such a profound discovery, and he remained amazed by the chain of events his aerial photography had set in motion. "I was just trying to take some pretty pictures," he told reporters after the service. "But I guess sometimes the desert decides it's time to give up its secrets." The Hartwell case became a subject of study for search and rescue organizations across the Southwest. The family's survival strategies, the effectiveness of their signaling attempts, and the factors that led to their deaths were all analyzed to improve future rescue operations. The case also highlighted the dangers of desert travel, particularly for families with children. The Hartwells had been well prepared for their journey, but they had underestimated the risks of deviating from established routes. Their story became a cautionary tale about the importance of staying on main roads and maintaining communication with the outside world. Detective Rodriguez, who had inherited the case from Detective Kozlowski, reflected on the investigation's conclusion in his final report. "The Hartwell family's story is both tragic and inspiring," he wrote. "They faced an impossible situation with courage and dignity, and they stayed together until the end." Michael's attempt to save his family, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrates the best of human nature. The desert location where the family had died was marked with a simple memorial, placed there by Tom Hartwell and other surviving relatives. The memorial consisted of 4 stones arranged in a circle, with a plaque reading, "In memory of the Hartwell family, David, Linda, Sarah, and Michael. Together in life, together in death." The old Highway 99, where the family had become lost, remained largely abandoned. But the Hartwell case had brought new attention to the dangers of the route, and warning signs were posted to discourage travelers from attempting to navigate the deteriorated road. The case files, now complete, filled several boxes in the sheriff's office archives. The investigation had generated thousands of pages of reports, hundreds of photographs, and countless hours of recorded interviews. But the most important evidence was the simple fact that the family had been found, their fate determined, and their story told. Dr. Morrison, the forensic anthropologist who had worked on both the original investigation and its resolution, published a paper about the case in a professional journal. Her analysis of the family's survival and the desert's preservative effects contributed to the scientific understanding of human remains in arid environments. The Hartwell case demonstrates both the challenges and the possibilities of desert forensics, she wrote. The extreme environment that killed this family also preserved the evidence of their final days, allowing us to understand their story 24 years later. The case had particular resonance for other families who had lost loved ones in the desert. The Hartwell's story provided both hope and closure for those who continued to search for missing relatives, demonstrating that even decades-old cases could be solved with persistence and new technology. Marcus Chen continued his drone photography hobby, but the Hartwell discovery had changed his perspective on the desert. He now flew his aircraft with an awareness of the human stories that might be hidden in the seemingly empty landscape below. "Every time I see something unusual in the desert, I think about the Hartwells," he said in an interview 6 months after the discovery. "The desert looks empty, but it's full of stories. Some of them are just waiting to be found." The technology that had made the discovery possible, high-definition aerial photography, GPS navigation, and digital communication, represented a dramatic advancement from the tools available in 1999. The Hartwell family had died in an era when cell phones were less reliable and GPS systems were not widely available. Their story highlighted how quickly technology had evolved and how it might prevent similar tragedies in the future. The case also demonstrated the power of persistence in cold case investigations. Detective Kozlowski had never given up hope that the family would be found, and her careful documentation of the original investigation had provided crucial information for the final resolution. 24 years is a long time to wait for answers, she reflected during a television interview about the case. But some cases are worth waiting for. The Hartwell family deserved to be found, and their story deserved to be told. The desert where the family had died remained largely unchanged, indifferent to the human drama that had played out among its rocks and sand. But for those who knew the story, the landscape was forever marked by the courage and tragedy of 4 people who had faced the ultimate test of human endurance. Marcus Chen uploaded his footage to YouTube 6 months after the investigation concluded. The video, titled "The Family Photo That Solved a 24-Year Mystery," became his first viral hit, garnering over 2 million views in its first week. But success felt hollow when he thought about the price paid for those views. The Hartwell case had begun with a family's dream of adventure and discovery, a journey across America that was meant to bring them closer together. In the end, it had accomplished exactly that goal, though not in the way they had planned. The family that had set out to see the country together had indeed stayed together, through the worst ordeal imaginable and beyond. The desert had kept its secret for 24 years, holding the Hartwell family in its silent embrace while the world wondered what had happened to them. But secrets, even those buried in the vast emptiness of the American Southwest, cannot remain hidden forever. Sometimes I wonder what else is out there, waiting to be discovered. How many other families have vanished into that endless expanse of sand and stone? How many other stories are buried beneath the shifting dunes, their voices silenced but not forgotten? The desert doesn't give up its secrets easily, but when it does, when the wind finally shifts the sand just right, or when a drone pilot happens to point his camera in the exact spot where the sun catches something metallic, that's when the dead finally get to tell their stories. What haunts me most isn't what we found in that canyon. It's what we might never find. Somewhere out there, in the vastness of the American desert, other families are waiting. Other voices are trapped in cameras and journals and final recordings, waiting for someone to stumble upon their resting places. The Hartwells were lucky, if you can call it that. They were found. Their story was told. But how many others remain silent in the sand, their secrets locked away until the desert decides, if it ever decides, to let them go? Maybe the answer lies in another buried camera, in another faded photograph weighted down by stones. Or maybe, just maybe, we'll never know. And perhaps that's the most terrifying truth of all. For 24 years, the desert kept its secret, but even the silence can't hide everything forever.